Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center, now in its second year, is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Bob Kincaid, thank you very much for that introduction and for a reminder that we are into our second year here at the Virtual Center. This is wonderful. It'll be exactly 2 years, the 1st of March. We'll be into our beginning our third year of broadcasting, but we are into the final throes of our second year now. So again, it is a pleasure to be with you at the Virtual Center today on this very, very cold and getting colder Monday. It is the 5th day of January in the year 2015. I think we all need to say that more than once in order to get used to the change in years. I was making a comment to a couple of friends over the weekend that for years I've been saying all the time, when the new year comes, it's always difficult to get used to writing the new year on checks. But the fact of the matter is, what I'm realizing now is that as you get older, the new year seems to come around so fast. We know that the year is 12 months long, but in fact, in point of fact, it seems like about 6, to be honest with you. You just get used to putting down 2014, and it's 15. I hope that your weekend was as pleasurable as mine, and I look forward to another week here at the Virtual Center to begin our new year. As we ended last year, before actually the last day of the year, if you remember, last Wednesday, we were focusing principally on the Supreme Court, on the role of the judicial branch of government, by looking at Hamilton's Federalist papers on the judiciary, on the judicial system. We'll continue that today. I look forward to it. I look forward to being here with you at the Virtual Center. I would love to hear from you. Our phone number is, we have a reserved phone number that is just so that you can get on the air. The number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to email me directly, and I'm going to begin today's program with a response to a couple of emails from listeners, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Before we get into any of the substance of today's program, I wanted to make an announcement which I think is important. I'll try to remember to introduce it after our break at the beginning of the second hour as well. Tomorrow, Tuesday, is usually the day that we start our programs 1/2 hour late. We usually begin at 1:30 p.m. in the East. However, tomorrow, and tomorrow only, I have talked to Bob about the possibility of postponing our start for a full hour tomorrow and not beginning our program until 2 p.m. tomorrow. And that would mean that our program tomorrow will only go for 60 minutes. The reason for that is, as I have mentioned numerous times, I attend a Rotary Club meeting at noon on Tuesdays. And the meeting ends at 1, so I can't get back to the house, back to home in time to get into the program until 1:30. Tomorrow, the president of the club has requested a quick kind of an emergency board meeting of the executive board immediately following the close of the meeting at 1 p.m. So that meeting will run at least a half an hour, probably about 40 minutes. So I won't be able to get home and on the air tomorrow until, with luck, 2 p.m. So please kind of make a note. that if you look for us on the air tomorrow at 1:30 and we're not there, it's not something you've done and the program is not canceled. We're just beginning half hour later than usual, which on Tuesdays is a half hour later each week. So I hope that that's not too confusing, but if you are in the Eastern time zone, tomorrow will be 2 p.m. And of course, depending on where you are, the time will change. But we'll be beginning 1 hour later tomorrow than we are today, and then we will be on Wednesday. So again, I look forward. I welcome you to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I mentioned that I received a few emails over the weekend that I did want to respond to. One of them, in fact, they were from the same listener, Gene, who sent me a couple of really rich links on education, and I think he knows, obviously, from listening to our program, that I'm very, very interested in pieces, informative pieces that would relate to education in the country, whether it be higher education or K through 12 education. And one of the things that that Gene sent was a link to an article, which is very short, but it includes some absolutely fantastic data on the issue of genius in the world, not just within the United States, but worldwide. And of course, one of the things we're dealing with is an educational system and educational innovation that is having worldwide impacts. And of course, it is having a very, very distinct impact on the leadership of the United States, which has been very traditional in education, but as we know, has slipped and continues to slip precipitously in the last several years. Basically, I guess what I would say is we're falling behind, and I think we know that. So I don't want to do an entire program today necessarily on education, but I did want to share some of this data with you because it's interesting. And basically, what the title of the article is, Wasted Genius. And what it refers to is presuming a bell-shaped curve that would incorporate all the billions of people in the world. What percentage of people would fall into the categories of genius? What percentages would fall into the category of superior intelligence and that of higher intelligence? If you assumed a bell-shaped curve where obviously most of the intelligence would kind of coalesce towards the center. So your extremes would be, your extreme low intelligence levels and your extremely high level intelligence levels would be on either end of the so-called bell-shaped curve. Basically, this is the data, and I think it's really worth thinking about, reflecting upon. First of all, there are 1.2 billion people in the world between the ages of 15 and 25, which is obviously the traditional age for addressing questions related to intelligence and genius at the higher education level. So between the ages of 15 and 25, there are, on average, obviously, 1.2 billion people in the world. If you extrapolate the IQ bell-shaped curve distribution over those 1.2 million young people in the world, it breaks down into the following. 1.2 million people would be considered genius. 1.2 million out of 1.2 billion. 24 million would fall into the category of superior intelligence, and 168 million would be classified as high intelligence. 1.2 million genius, 24 million superior intelligence, 168 million high intelligence. This data goes on. If we estimate that the top 500 universities in the world have an average undergraduate population of 10,000 students, that's quite an assumption or an estimate. But if we assume that the top 500 universities in the world have an average undergraduate population enrollment of 10,000 students, and if we assume that every student at one of those 500 universities has an IQ of 130 or higher, which is questionable, obviously, then there would still be 20.2 million young people of superior or genius intelligence without access to an elite education. And that doesn't even begin to get to the population of people with high intelligence. Of course, the other fact to remember is that of those 20.2 million superior or genius young people, 12.12 million are Asian, 60%. 1.7 million are Latin American, 8.5%. 3 million are African, 15%. 1 million are Eastern European, 5%. While only 1 million are Western European, that's 5%. 1 million are American or Canadian, 5%. So in other words, it gives you some perspective, some idea as to how we measure up as we look at the global context of higher education and the ability of institutions to address the issues of higher education to the world's brightest people. Basically, again, if you take the top 500 universities in the world and you assume that each of them enrolls 10,000 students each, and if you also assume that every student enrolled in those universities has an IQ of 130 or higher, which of course we know is more than likely not true, there would still be 20 plus million people of superior or genius intelligence that wouldn't be enrolled in one of these elite institutions. And that doesn't even touch the population with so-called high intelligence, which we already figured to be about 168 million people. What that suggests is that there's an awful lot of untapped talent in the world. And it seems to me that for the future of the world, we better go about tapping into it. But even more important than that, when you break it down as to where in the world this talent is, of the 20.2 million people that are currently not receiving the elite education that our assumptions are based upon, 60% of them would be Asian, 8.5% of them would be Latin American, 15% of them would be African, 5% of them would be Eastern European, 5% would be Western European, 5% would be American or Canadian. So what that suggests, obviously, is that the untapped higher intelligence or genius intelligence that is not currently being served is disproportionately outside the Western Hemisphere, outside the Western Hemisphere, and overwhelmingly not located in the continental United States or Canada in North America. This data goes on. Yet of the top 500 universities in the world, 87% are in the Anglosphere and Europe. 12% are in Asia, of which about 80% are in Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, which are all developed countries. 1% are in Latin America. 0.6% are in Africa. What this data suggests then is that our institutions are bunched in the areas of the world where we find potentially the least talent. Or to put it another way, our institutions are not located in the places where the genius is, where the intelligence is. What that means is the vast majority of the millions of unserved people out there not only are not being served, but it doesn't look like, at least in the immediate future, they're going to be served for a long time. What that means is that the 500 institutions, the highest, most elite institutions, as it were, are all located in one area of the world competing with each other for a rather small proportion of the world's talent. In a sense, when I looked at this data, and again, I want to thank Gene for the link because I think it's incredible. When I looked at this data, one of the analogies I made is higher education within the United States itself. There used to be, when I was in graduate school, and this would have been obviously in the late 60s and early 1970s, I can remember when I was teaching classes, education classes, history of education classes, one of the comments that I made in class on several occasions was the fact that one of the operative assumptions of our education system is that all learning happens in school. Our whole system seems to be based on the idea that if learning is going to happen, you've got to create an institution within which it must happen. We know that's not true. We know that's a faulty assumption. But I would suggest to you it is an assumption that has really been at the foundation of the funding of the tens of millions and billions of dollars that have gone into our higher education establishment in terms of bricks and mortar and the associated infrastructure that goes with it. The entire assumption which has driven the expansion of education in our country has been based on the assumption that if education is going to happen, you need to build an institution in order to have a place where it can happen. What we're beginning to realize now, and I think that distance education, distance learning, and the internet, probably more than anything else, is bringing this truth home to us. What we're becoming more and more aware of now is that education can happen outside the traditional classroom. The problem is most of those people that are involved in higher education are unwilling to accept that, if they've even ever thought about it. Because most of the people who are in education, who are in our classrooms and in the administration of our institutions, most of them buy into the assumption that the only learning that is taking place is happening within an institution somewhere. Most of them have not really addressed the reality of the fact that that's obviously not true. And again, I think the potential for distance learning, especially via the internet, has driven that point home. But the resistance to serve that population on the part of our traditional institutions is an indication of how unwilling the educational establishment is to accept the realities of the kind of data that we have here in our hands. And as bad as the situation is within the United States, within our American educational system, our higher education system to be specific, this data suggests that the situation is even worse when you look at it from a global perspective. We are building our educational establishment to serve only a small portion of the available talent in the world. And what we are doing is allowing the vast majority of the creativity and talent in the world to remain under or unserved totally. The internet promises ways to address this issue. But in order to do it, we're going to have a sea change in the assumptions and the priorities of those who make educational policy in this country, whether it be in government, whether it be within education itself, or whatever. We have a situation right here where I'm standing in southern West Virginia right now. The big news of the new year, the big news in southern West Virginia on New Year's Day was the headlines in all the local papers that our state university, West Virginia University, has agreed to purchase an existent vacated campus here in southern West Virginia, in fact in the town that I'm in, which is Beckley, West Virginia, and has agreed to begin to bring the services of West Virginia State University to the southern part of the state for the first time. To say that the population in southern West Virginia, the people of southern West Virginia, the business community, the political community, to say that this southern part of West Virginia is not ecstatic would be a serious understatement. Our business community sees all of this business coming into the area, all of these new stores opening, and more homes and more population and more business for our restaurants and our theaters and our department stores and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, West Virginia's southern counties have been and continue to lose population for several years because there are no jobs. In fact, as a point of information, if you draw a line from the eastern part of West Virginia, where the Interstate 64 from Lexington, Virginia, goes straight west through Virginia and into West Virginia, and then at mid-West Virginia turns north and runs up to the state capital, which is Charleston, which is about 55 miles north of Beckley. Beckley is right at the turn, right at the intersection of these interstates. If you draw a line parallel or contiguous with that interstate, and then you look at the map of West Virginia, every single county south of that line is losing population. Every single one. Not only that, but if you go a little bit south of West Virginia into western Virginia, every single community college in western Virginia is losing enrollment as well. So what that means is that the pond remains the same size. The number of fish is decreasing precipitously, but the number of fishermen continues to increase. We have more and more institutions coming into this area. Right now we have 7 4-year higher education institutions serving southern West Virginia. And now with the state university coming into Beckley, that's 8. What obviously this means is that there's going to be greater competition for fewer and fewer students. It is not an efficient use of resources. On the contrary, it seems to suggest about the most inefficient use of resources that one can imagine. But in order to turn inefficiency into efficiency, it is absolutely vital that some of the assumptions, some of the operative assumptions that drive our decision making in higher education need to change. And I think the data that we've looked at here worldwide suggests the same thing. We need a major change in the way those responsible for delivering education to people envision the product. When I saw this data on a worldwide basis, and again, it's all projected. We don't know how many people are in the town we live in, let alone how many people there are in the world. It's obviously a guess, an estimate. But the fact of the matter is, if you extrapolate that number assume the realities of the bell-shaped curve, then you can project and estimate the numbers in order to support the conclusions that those numbers seem to suggest. They seem to suggest that we really need to rethink our whole approach to education. No longer, and let me interrupt here as an aside and make a point that I had said I was not going to spend the whole program today on education, and I don't intend to. But the fact of the matter is, now that I'm into it, I think I might as well at least go long enough to make the most relevant points. It seems to me one of the major deficiencies in our whole education establishment at all levels, whether it be K through 12 or whether it be higher education, a major assumption in our education systems at all levels is that everybody is not educable. It goes all the way back to, well, actually it goes back further, but for us here at the Virtual Center, we can take it back to to sources that we've already looked at, to the 18th century, Jefferson's Bill for the General Diffusion of Knowledge in Virginia, Benjamin Rush's Mode of Education Proper in a Republic for the state of Pennsylvania, written in the 1780s. And basically what their whole approach to the way they looked at education was to take the assumptions about the few and the many that they believed constituted the structure of society itself and apply them to the educational situation as well. The implication is that the same few and many which define society or community defined education as well. The few had the intelligence to benefit from a quality education. The many did not. Where the innovation came from Jefferson and Benjamin Rush and others was the idea that what you had to do was tailor education to the abilities of the students you were going to be serving, i.e., set up one educational system for the people that you didn't believe were educable, capable of handling quality education, but at the same time make sure that you put the resources into the best education for the most talented people. We've talked about those assumptions off and on throughout the entire time that we've been here at the Virtual Center. But what I would like to point out is the operative assumption that seems to drive this. And it is that everybody can't be educated. Let me be crude. Let me be blunt. What it translates into is that you educate the few, you train the many. And Benjamin Rush's mode of education proper in a republic was oriented towards the idea that if we were to have a republican form of government, which really involved massive participation on the parts of the citizenry, then you had to provide the kind of educational grounding, the kind of educational training necessary so that young people, citizens, would understand and know what was expected of them in a republic. But what was expected of them was not education, it was good behavior. It was morality, it was ethics, it was doing the right thing. It was willingness to work, it was self-reliance, it was all of the values that we know so much about. So that's what our education system for the masses emphasizes. Not quality education, not analysis, not evaluation, not research skills, none of those things. Rather, what the education for the masses focuses on is rote. Education for the few constitutes a search for truth. Education for the many focuses on the delivery of truth, the assumption that we know what it is, and our job is to translate or to deliver truth to those who don't have it. Basically, then, the operative premise of our education system is that everybody cannot be educated. In fact, that the majority cannot. This is obviously the same kind of operative assumption that constitutes the problem demonstrated in this data, which suggests that all of our elite educational institutions are located in certain areas, and the vast majority of the world where the genius and the talent is are not being adequately served. Obviously, on the same assumptions, driven by the same assumptions that drive our educational planning within this country. It seems to me then, if you think about that, just take that principle and reduce it down to the individual teacher in the individual classroom. I don't care if it's a college level or whether it's K through 12 level. But if you are the teacher standing in front of a group of students, and everything you do is based on the assumption that only 1 out of 4 students, and that's generous, 1 out of every 4 students, or maybe even 1 out of every 5 students, is going to be able to handle what you have to offer. And that your job as a classroom manager is to find a way to keep the 75% busy while you concentrate on trying to educate the 25%. I think if you think about the issues we've been talking about on an abstract global level, and you reduce them down to what happens in the individual classroom, it's really disturbing. Now, for purposes of emphasis, take what we've just looked at with the individual classroom and now go back to the broader perspective. How are you going to deal with the challenges that confront mankind when those responsible for educating them operate on the assumption that only 1 out of every 4 or 1 out of every 5 people can be educated? Obviously, the only efficient way you can deal with that reality, if you assume that it is a reality, is to find a way to identify who the most brilliant people happen to be within that larger context. In other words, how do I find the 1 in 4 or the 1 in 5? The way to do it is to create an approach to education which constitutes a competition. Where you put everybody into competition with everybody else on the assumption that the talent will rise to the top. The cream will rise to the top. Jefferson's Bill for General Diffusion of Knowledge makes that point. He calls it periodic rising of the cream, so to speak. The rising periodically of the cream of ability is the way Jefferson phrases it. Then all you need to do is skim the ability off the top, and that becomes your talent pool. What that means effectively is that you are potentially discarding 3 out of every 4 or 4 out of every 5, depending on how you look at the numbers, human beings. Given the problems that confront today's world, we cannot continue to discard 75 or 80% of our population, whether it's our local population, our national population, or the world's population. We can't afford to do that. But I would suggest to you that the way we approach education is driven by these assumptions, is built upon them. And until you find a way to shatter those assumptions, you confront an obstacle which is monumental if you try to change the system of education. Basically, what we've developed is a system of education that is quantifiable, that is verifiable, because the one thing you want is data that you can rely on. So by turning education into the mastery of content, and then instituting these standardized tests which measure ability, it seems like the method of quantification is perfect for the system you've devised, which is based on the assumptions you've made, which I would suggest are very, very questionable and very, very faulty. Going back to the individual classroom again, it seems to me that what we have to find a way to do in our classrooms is to convince teachers at all levels that the goal, the objective, is not to educate the few well, but to find ways to educate everybody well. To assume, for purposes of operation, that everybody can learn. Obviously, everybody can't learn at the same level. That will show. That will reveal itself. But it can never happen for most kids or most young people if the establishment that they depend on to deliver their education is assuming going in that they can't learn. And that my principal goal for this particular student is to generate enough data to prove to them that they are not capable of what we are asking from them. What a horrible, negative situation for so many people. How much talent are we discarding? Are we ignoring? Are we overlooking? The internet makes it possible to deliver education to people that we've never been able to reach before. But I would suggest if it's the same kind of education, then we're really not accomplishing anything meaningful. And I would suggest that this kind of quantifiable, measurable education, which by definition is content-based, it's driven on the assumption that the information is truth, that the information delivered is the education, when in fact we know that the information delivered is merely the basis upon which education can happen. Education happens within people, not classrooms, not curriculum guides, not textbooks. Education, real education, happens within people. Then what you have to do is try to find ways to turn on what counts in those people. And that means a totally different approach to education. But we can do it. We've got the technology to do it. We need to begin to question the assumptions which are causing the current system of education to remain so inflexible. I think there's obviously a direction which I don't plan to go in today, because this wasn't even in my plans for today, and I've pretty well eaten up the 3/4 of our first hour here. But it seems to me that a logical next step on this particular way of thinking would be the Common Core standards. Because I would suggest what appeals to me about the standards is the potential that they contain for the kind of changes that I'm talking about. I see in the Common Core, with the kinds of questions that are raised by the objectives at all levels. It doesn't matter if you look at the standards, and I've looked at them in grade 6, in grade 8, in grade 11, which are the 3 years that the NAEP test focuses on in terms of the measurements of educational success in the nation, the annual NAEP test. that if you look at the standards in the objectives, what it is that teachers are supposed to do at these levels, nobody is dictating content. The benefit of a good teacher in the classroom is the ability to come up with creative content and creative ways to teach. But the objectives are that at the end of a particular unit, students will be able to do certain things. They will be able to think, and they will be able to evaluate, and they will be able to read critically, and they will be able to compare, and they will be able to assess, and they will know how to do research, and they will know how to find information, and they will know how to evaluate data, and they will know how to rank data in terms of most important versus least important. And they will be able to argue for a particular point of view so that they can use data in order to support a particular interpretation. This, I would suggest to you, has been higher education for the elite all along. Somehow we have got to make it available to the many. Once we make the decision to do that, then I think the internet becomes invaluable. But so long as the internet becomes a vehicle to deliver the package, the kind of education we've already been focusing on, then its potential is not close to being fulfilled. Anyway, that's kind of the issue. But I wanted to, well, I had this data in my hand. I was afraid that it would slip. It's all on one piece of paper. I copied the particular piece that Gene sent to me, sent the link for, and I thought I'll lose this if I don't get it on and share it with folks right away, because I think it speaks to a worldwide issue, but it's an issue that pertains to our local national situation as well. And the example I used of the University of West Virginia University coming to southern West Virginia is an example of how close and how pertinent this data is here. The data that really defines the educational situation here in southern West Virginia is a perfect example of this data that the email generates on the international level. It suggests that those responsible for delivering education are basically not doing it in an efficient manner at all. Even the best education. Because the fact of the matter is, this data talks about high intelligence, superior intelligence, and genius. And as we know, that's only a very, very small percentage of the population. But in this country, in this republic, we have committed to the idea of educating everybody. But the fact of the matter is, we really haven't begun to do it. And that's, I think, where we need to go. It's 48 minutes after the hour. We've got a little bit more than 10 minutes left in our first hour. And obviously, I kind of went off on a tangent there. I had the data in my hand, but little else. And I didn't have any notes. I didn't have a plan specifically for this. I thought I would just make reference to the data, share the data with you, and then move on. But once I got into the data, I got a little bit excited about it because I think it's very relevant data. Anyway, you are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're at 49 minutes after the hour. So I thought that in the 10 minutes that's left in our first hour, let's go back and revisit the judicial branch of government as addressed by Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. The last time we were together, last week, we spent the bulk of our time together looking at Federalist number 78. And perhaps for the next 10 minutes of this hour, before we take our break at the top of the hour, we can spend this 10 minutes in reviewing Federalist 78. And then when we come back in our second hour, we can look at where Hamilton goes from 78 on. Because those Federalist papers addressing the courts begin with 78, but they extend to 79, 80, and 81. And actually 82. 82 deals with trial by jury, so the right of citizens to expect that the Constitution of the United States will not deny citizens the right to trial by jury. But the four Federalist papers that deal with the structure and operation of this federal court system and lay out the operative symmetry between the state courts and the federal courts under the Constitution are pretty much included in Federalist Papers 78, 79, 80, and 81. Consequently, I thought this week that that's probably ought to be our objective. That by the time we finish our programming this week at the Virtual Center, we ought to be pretty familiar with not only the structure of our judicial system, but also the rationale behind it as articulated by Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. All the time keeping in mind that Alexander Hamilton is writing the Federalist Papers in order to reassure people that the dangers and the threats from the federal government being created by the Constitution are nothing to worry about. What the Federalist Papers are designed to do is reassure a skeptical and confused public that the dangers which many are pointing to in the new Constitution are unfounded or overblown. In other words, the Federalist Papers, by definition, are at least to a degree political. It is not objective analysis of data. There's no way that the authors of the Federalist Papers, be it Hamilton, Madison, or John Jay, are going to include negatives and concerns about the Constitution that they don't put to rest. Because their goal at the end of each paper is to reassure a doubtful public that the Constitution promises positive things and will not deliver the kind of negatives that its opponents are projecting. So again, if we are to set out and review for a few moments, and we can take the first few minutes of our second hour to do this as well. We can take about 10 minutes and review the major points of Federalist number 78, which we dealt with last Wednesday. We went through the entire paper in our second hour. I've scribbled down some notes. This is one of the few times that I've made notes. I really thought it would expedite and get us into the other Federalist papers quicker. So I thought rather than taking too much time on Federalist number 78, which is review, I would just list some of the major points from it so that we could move on. However, one of the things I ended up with is the points that I listed, total 8. I have 8 major things that I think we can learn from Federalist number 78. So let's begin, and we can pick it up in our second hour, and what we don't accomplish today we can complete tomorrow in our program on Wednesday. First of all, I think the first thing that we need to be aware of about Federalist number 78 is that contrary to the general assumptions written by attorneys and historians and scholars, constitutional history scholars, one of the major assumptions which they have made is that Federalist number 78 is where the principle of judicial review is founded, is established. That is not true. So I think that's the first thing we need to know about Federalist number 78. It is not about judicial review. Rather, it operates, Federalist number 78 is written on the assumption that judicial review is included in the Constitution of the United States. It's assumed to be there. We don't need a Federalist paper to establish it because it's already there. All we need to do is acknowledge it. In fact, one of the things we'll see this week, I think, is that Federalist number 81 actually is a little bit more definitive about judicial review than is 78. But be that as it may, what Hamilton says in Federalist number 78, and we included quotes from James Madison and Elbridge Gerry and as well as Hamilton, to make the point that at the Constitutional Convention, the principle of judicial review was generally assumed to be there. Not only did proponents of the Constitution assume that judicial review was part of the powers associated with the judicial system, the judicial branch of government, but even the opponents, and Hamilton makes specific reference to Robert Yates, his fellow delegate from New York, who criticizes the Constitution of the United States because he is assuming that judicial review is there. And his concern is that judicial review implies judicial supremacy, and that in a Republican government you must have legislative supremacy. If you don't have legislative supremacy, then Republican government, popular government, is not there. So in a sense, Robert Yates's major point about the courts, concern about the courts in the Constitution, is that because they will be able to interpret law and determine whether man-made law created by legislatures is or is not consistent with the Constitution of the United States, the power to do that constitutes judicial supremacy. It's going to make the courts superior to the branch of government which actually writes the law, the legislature. And what Hamilton sets out in number 78 to do is to refute, not judicial review, but to refute judicial supremacy. He sets out to deny that judicial review means judicial supremacy. That's one of the points that we made last Wednesday, in last Wednesday's review of number 78. So again, the purpose of number 78, Federalist number 78, is to refute, not just deny, but refute anti-Federalist allegations of judicial supremacy. The idea that the branch of government that says what the law is superior to the branch of government that actually writes the law. And that's Hamilton's whole point in 78, is to refute that assumption. The next point that Federalist number 78 makes is that it is absolutely crucial in order for the judicial branch of government to carry out the functions intended for it in the Constitutional Convention. The independence of the courts is critical. Hamilton makes the point in 78 that the judicial branch is the weakest of the three branches. The executive branch, the president, Hamilton says, has access to the sword. It has the power to enforce its will. The legislative branch controls the purse. It has the power to defund the other branches and thereby exercise its power. But Hamilton's point is that the judicial branch really doesn't have any of those powers. And then he makes the point that it really has to rely on support, especially from the executive, in order to carry out its will, because it doesn't have the power to enforce its own will. And I think the example that I used last Wednesday was the very famous one of President Andrew Jackson in response to a court decision rendered by John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in which President Jackson made the comment that John Marshall has made the decision, let him try to enforce it. Let's see if he can enforce it. Because the courts really don't have the power. They have to rely on the powers of the other branch to respect the power of the courts and adhere to it. Anyway, those are the first three key elements, it seems to me, of Federalist number 78. There are 5 more, and we will begin our second hour with them. It is 1 minute after the top of the hour, 1 minute after 2 in the East. Why don't we pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll engage in our second hour. We'll begin with a review of 78, and then we'll begin to look at 79 and hopefully 80. And at least we can get through those today, and then we can look at 81 tomorrow and or Wednesday. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us.
To the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. That was a wonderful, wonderful saxophone. I appreciate the music, the selection of the music very, very much. Really kind of upbeat on a Monday. Really, really good stuff. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're into our second hour. If you are just joining us on this Monday, the 5th day of January, 2015, welcome to the program. If you've been with us through the first hour, then I want to thank you for being with us. The objective today for the entire 2 hours was to look more continue our examination of the court system as viewed through the Federalist Papers. But I got a little diverted in the first hour and spent the bulk of it on some data from education, which again I have I owe a gratitude, very tremendous gratitude, to Gene, our listener, who alerted me to the website where that data was available, and I just thought it was extremely meaningful data, and I wanted to get it on air, so that it would be there and we would all have it. We could go back to it. We can reflect upon it as we will. So we did that. And so now we're looking at our the review of Federalist number 78, which is the Federalist paper we looked at in some depth last Wednesday, but since it was 5 days ago, it seems to me that some sort of review or reminder, if you will, is in order. So that's what we are doing. We would love to hear from you. I would love to hear from you, and I know our other listeners would as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676, which translate into 663 HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to email me directly, just as Gene did and as Horst has done from Taiwan and as a number of our listeners have done in the past, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien906@gmail.com. And again, O'Brien is spelled B-R-I-E-N, and there is no apostrophe, no punctuation at all. It's all one word. Again, either way, I would love to hear from you because, again, this is a conversation. This is intended to be that. Of course, in our presentation on the courts, we are looking at, I'm trying to use this tremendous opportunity that we have here on the Head On Radio Network to share with you some of the strengths of the Federalist Papers, because I do believe that in spite of the fact that many people claim to be familiar with the Federalist Papers, the fact of the matter is most people don't ever really read them unless they are assigned particular papers of particular portions of a particular paper. Here at the Virtual Center, we've taken on the challenge of looking at what I believe are some of the most substantive ones. And again, I remind you again that while the Federalist Papers are in print, that's primary source material, the comments that I make are interpretive. They are the way I read it. I am soliciting, I am looking for, I am encouraging your reaction to the comments that I might make. I'm hoping that the information is valuable. I'm hoping that the interpretations I make are at least interesting or provocative enough to warrant some reflection on your part. Because in the process of reflecting on these issues, you learn them. In fact, through the process of reflecting on these issues, if you do that, I learn them. And that's why I'm so solicitous of your willingness to share and participate actively in our program. Again, before going on with Federalist number 78, let me remind you that tomorrow's program on the 6th of January will begin 1 hour later than we did today. It will begin at this time tomorrow. We will be reduced for tomorrow only to a 1 hour program, and then each Tuesday after the incoming Tuesdays we'll go back to our regular format of 90-minute, 1.5 hour programs. So we will have 2 hours on Mondays and 2 hours on Wednesdays and a 1.5 hour program on Tuesdays. Tomorrow is the exception. We'll just have a 1 hour program tomorrow. We were looking at Federalist number 78, and we looked at a couple of what I think are the major conclusions that we can draw from it. The first one being that despite assumptions to the contrary, Hamilton's purpose in number 78 is not to validate or to demonstrate or to establish the principle of judicial review in the Constitution of the United States. Hamilton, along with many of the other founders, assumes that judicial review is indeed part of the Constitution. Those at the convention assumed that. Even opponents to the Constitution assumed that. Rather, Hamilton's purpose in number 78 is to deny the allegation of anti-federalists that the principle of judicial review translates into judicial supremacy. So again, the overall purpose of number 78 is not to demonstrate or establish judicial review. Rather, it is to make the point that judicial review does not constitute judicial supremacy. Because the anti-federalists argue, rightly so, that Republican government requires legislative supremacy, since the legislature is the branch of government closest to the people. And so if you claim to have a republic, then your legislature must be supreme. It must drive the operations, so to speak. And the anti-federalist criticism of the judicial provisions of the Constitution are that the assumptions of judicial review would turn the Supreme Court or turn the federal courts into the supreme branch at the expense of the legislature. And Hamilton's paper, number 78, is intended to refute that argument. Again, Hamilton argues as another point that the independence of the judiciary is critical. It is absolutely critical that separation of powers be adhered to. Many people believe, many critics of the Constitution believe, that the decisions related to whether a particular law is constitutional or not could be made by a portion of the legislative branch, like the Senate. And they point out that, for example, in Great Britain, the House of Lords serves the judicial review function within the British system. And they also point out that many of the state constitutions follow this principle and establish upper branches in their legislatures whose job it is to review legislation to make sure that it's consistent with the state constitution. Hamilton's point is that in order for the judiciary to fulfill its functions as envisioned in the Constitution of the United States by the framers at the Constitutional Convention, it is absolutely essential that the judiciary be independent of the other two branches. And in Federalist number 78, Hamilton touches on the various ways that that independence is guaranteed. Lifetime appointments is one way. Judicial salaries that cannot be reduced is another way, and that's number 79. We'll get to that later. It is critical, in Hamilton's view, that the Constitution of the United States allows the Senate, after the case being brought by the House, to impeach justices. That's the only way that you can get rid of justices of the Supreme Court, is to impeach them for malfeasance in office. That way, the fear that appointment for life will become dictatorial is avoided. But Hamilton believes that removing judges needs to be very difficult, because judges need to be very independent, because what is expected of them within our constitutional framework requires their willingness to stand up against some pretty powerful opposition, be it the other two branches of government, be it the majority of the people itself. Consequently, the independence of the judiciary is critical. Hamilton sees the court, the judicial branch, not as supreme, but as sort of the middleman, if you will, between the people and their representatives in the legislature. He sees the courts as a check on the abuse of legislative power. A republic must embody legislative supremacy. But in order to make sure that that supremacy does not constitute abuse of power, it requires an independent judiciary. But that doesn't mean, Hamilton says, that the judicial branch is superior to the legislative branch. All it means is that the will of the people is superior to both. And the role of the courts in exercising the power of judicial review by weighing man-made law, statute law, against the Constitution, which is fundamental law, the role of the court is to serve as an intermediary. When the representatives of the people are operating contrary to the Constitution of the United States, it's the role of the courts to say that. And whenever there's a conflict between statute law and fundamental law, it is the responsibility of the courts to always come down on the side of the Constitution, of fundamental law. Consequently, Hamilton argues in number 78, the judicial branch must see the Constitution as fundamental law and must see its role as a defender of fundamental law as well, as the will of the people. Whenever there's a conflict between the legislature and the Constitution, the court must always come down on the side of the Constitution, the side of fundamental law, not because of what the Constitution says, but because it's the Constitution, it's fundamental law. It's the will of the people always. Always. And that's the role of the court. The court's role, then, Hamilton says, is always judgment. It's judgment, never its will. When and if the court goes beyond its legitimate power to interpret law, to say what the law is, to offer its advice on what it sees as a conflict between man-made law and constitutional law and the Constitution. That's judgment. That's what the court does. But if the court chooses to go beyond that, Hamilton says, and tries to enact law by imposing its will on the nation in terms of the way it interprets the Constitution, that's a violation of the legitimate role that the judiciary is supposed to play. In other words, in number 78, Hamilton comes down very strongly against the idea that we know today as judicial activism, where courts should make law. We need to realize, of course, that this constitutes opposition. This is contrary to Madison's idea that the Constitution must constantly stay current. It must constantly reevaluate the Constitution in the face of changing circumstances. So I think we need to be aware of that there's a fine line, if you will, between judicial activism on the one hand and the legitimate responsibility of the courts to constantly reassess the Constitution in the face of changing circumstances. In other words, the idea of a living Constitution. Hamilton in number 78 is not denying the principle of a living Constitution. What he is saying is that the courts cannot get into the business of creating law because they can't get the law they believe is needed out of the legislature. The other thing, another role that Hamilton envisions for the court in number 78 is as a defender of minority rights. Whenever the people succumb to what Hamilton calls momentary inclinations or to the appeal of demagogues. This we made quite a bit of this particular point last Wednesday in Federalist number 78. Hamilton is very, very adamant that not only do the branches of government have to adhere to the Constitution, but the people of this nation must adhere to it as well. And that becomes a little bit difficult when the majority of the people want a particular thing to happen, which the court knows contradicts the Constitution, is unconstitutional. because the whole idea of the court's defense of judicial review is based on the idea that it is speaking the will of the people. It is representing or reflecting the will of the people. Well, if the majority of the people demand a change, which the court believes is contrary to the Constitution, it looks like we're in kind of an impasse. And Hamilton makes a major argument against the idea that it is very important to distinguish between the people's susceptibility to what he calls momentary inclinations and the people's right, as articulated in the Declaration of Independence, to abolish government and establish a new one when the social contract is broken, which is the argument, of course, that Jefferson made in the Declaration against King George III. So for Hamilton, this becomes a little bit of walking on thin ice. He's walking a very thin line here between the role of the court as spokesman for the will of the people on the one hand, and finding a way to distinguish between the real will of the people as would be reflected in a constitutional change, i.e. an amendment, and a momentary majority of the people who seem to be captivated by a particular point at a particular time, which in the long term the court might see as contrary to fundamental law. In this role of the court as standing up to a majority of the people when it feels that the majority is wrong, it is in that role that the court oftentimes becomes the defender of minority rights within a republic. Hamilton doesn't emphasize this. He infers it. This is probably a point that I didn't make clearly or strongly enough last Wednesday when we went over Federalist number 78. For political reasons, Hamilton can't address the issue of the court standing up to the rights of the minority against the majority. He can't do that because that would feed anti-federalist objections that the Constitution of the United States is principally driven by the desire to protect the interests of the wealthy against the interests of the poor. What Madison distinguishes as the majority faction and the minority faction. If Hamilton found himself in the position of arguing the court's role in defending property against the majority, the Constitution of the United States would never be ratified. It never would have been ratified. So Hamilton has to slide very shrewdly over or around this issue. And in this context, he talks about the role of the court as a defender of, quote, the virtuous and the disinterested, considerate men. What he's talking about here are the wealthy, the propertied. Of course, we're coming out of the Confederation, and we know that one of the major concerns of the founders, of the framers of the Constitution, was that in the Confederation, state legislatures were passing laws which violated contract, which infringed or interfered with the payment of private debts, the payment of taxes. It created things like paper money. It would inflate the currency. Or installment laws, estate laws, or many of the other pieces of legislation demanded by the majority of the poor. Hamilton envisions the court as being the branch of government that stands up against that at the federal level. So he talks in a very positive way about the court as protecting the rights of minorities. That's as far as he can go politically and get away with it. But the fact of the matter is, what he's talking about here is a reliance on the court to protect the interests of the few in society, the wealthy, when the majority of the people might organize into the majority faction and move against the minority. It's up to the court to defend property in that kind of a situation. This is my interpretation. Now, this is interpretive from Federalist number 78. A lot of this is inferred from what Hamilton says, but I have to acknowledge that he does not say this. If indeed what I am saying here is valid, then we ought not to be shocked by court decisions like Citizens United or any number of other decisions in which it seems like the courts are defending the interests of business against the interests of the people. In number 78, Hamilton is implying that that must be the role of the court. Because in a republic, if the courts don't do that, then a minority has no protection in a popular government. So in a sense, the independent judiciary included in the Constitution of the United States is the principal change from the state constitutions in this respect. Because when power was in the legislatures of the states and there was no federal power over the states, then there was nothing to stop majority abuse of minority rights. Now what Hamilton is looking at is the role that the courts will play in that particular challenge, in accomplishing that particular objective. I mean, I can see so many things that become clearer if you accept this principle. For example, the idea that we are a nation of laws and that we are principally governed by the rule of law. What does all that mean? What it means is that the majority of the people cannot take power. And it's up to the courts to make sure that doesn't happen. But Hamilton can't say this. He can't say any of this. His purpose is for the Constitution to be ratified. If he said this stuff, it wouldn't stand a chance of being ratified. That's why I think that Federalist number 78 is so important. Like Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 and some of the other Federalist papers written by Madison. Federalist number 78 is important not only for what it says, but for what it doesn't say. And I think to truly understand it, we've got to take it to that level. And finally, in number 78, Hamilton makes the point in defending the idea of lifetime appointments for justices. He emphasizes the expertise in the law that these justices will be presumed to have. You cannot trust people who are susceptible to political pressures, who stand for re-election, who can be fired, whose salary can be reduced. All of these things which the Constitution forbids. You cannot expect the kind of judicial wisdom and expertise that this Federalist paper demands on the part of justices if you have people who are elected or appointed only on a temporary basis. What you've got to do is you've got to tap into those very few people in society who are the most learned about the law. And you've got to keep them on the court. You've got to make sure they're independent from political pressures from all different sides. You've got to give them whatever protection you can give them in order to render the decisions that you're asking them to make. And one of those is you've got to give them lifetime appointments. You can't, demanding the kind of expertise that the court demands, you can't say that justices must retire at the age of 60. That would be ridiculous, Hamilton says. You've got to keep these people, because there aren't many of them, you've got to keep these people for as long as their wisdom and expertise is operable. Consequently, they have a right to lifetime appointment. And that, I believe, is really the essence of Federalist number 78. To say that it's one of the most important of the Federalist papers, I believe, is an understatement. In fact, I probably ought to apologize for the fact that we're almost 2 years into our programs before getting to this particular paper. But I think we've concentrated for the most part on the other aspects of the Constitution up till now, as well as the political context within the Constitution is written. I mean, this is not only a course in law or an approach to law that we're talking about here at the Virtual Center. We're talking about trying to understand the nature of the constitutional system we have within the context of the political realities of the time it was created. And we're also trying to see how that Constitution remains relevant as we move through generation after generation and circumstances changed. One of the papers that we dealt with some weeks ago was James Madison's piece on expanding the suffrage in order to address the realities of a larger and larger population in this country without property. And the idea that he hoped, that he planned or believed that the suffrage could constitute the kind of stake in society that would commit citizens to this system by letting them participate in its decisions. You could not continue to have a system, a republic, in which only those with property, only the wealthy, could meet property qualifications, because you were faced with a larger and larger number of people without property. People who lived in cities, people who worked in factories as the Industrial Revolution was taking form in the 19th century. And Madison's argument is the Constitution has to be flexible enough to accommodate the kind of changes which are going to allow the system, the republic, to withstand those political pressures and demographic pressures. So again, I think we've looked at a number of very important Federalist papers. Without question, Federalist 78 is one of the most important. But again, it is not important because of the principle of judicial review. I think there's much more to it than that, and the only way to know what's there is to read the paper. And that's what we've done. With that, we are now at 38 minutes after the hour, so we've got about little bit less than 20 minutes left in our time together today. And that ought to allow us to get through Federalist number 79 and into Federalist 80, which we can take up tomorrow in our abbreviated 1-hour program. But we have a 2-hour program scheduled for Wednesday. And I'm hoping that on Wednesday we'll be able to complete our look at the judicial branch of government by focusing on Federalist number 81, which I believe is in many ways quite significant because it deals with the relations between the Supreme Court and the inferior courts that the Constitution permits Congress to create. And it also addresses the relationship between federal courts and state courts. And I think those two issues are really important parts of understanding this whole aspect of the constitutional system created by our framers in 1787. With that then, let's take a brief look at Federalist number 79. I really believe, even though we have less than 20 minutes left in our program today, that 20 minutes is more than adequate to deal with number 79. Let me be specific. Federalist number 79 is probably the shortest of the Federalist Papers. It's the briefest. While the issues that it addresses are important, they are quite definitive, they are quite easily addressed, and they don't involve the number of implications and long-range suggestions and connections that 78 contains. Specifically, in Federalist number 78, Hamilton addresses two issues. The first one is the compensation of the judges, and the second one amounts to the ages of the justices. Specifically, the second one deals with replacing members of the Supreme Court. But the main focus that the anti-federalists are making is if you get justices that become very old, how do you get rid of them when they become infirm? Shouldn't we just establish a date and say when a justice turns 60, they must resign, retire? Given the role that Hamilton has defined for the Supreme Court, for members of the Supreme Court in number 78, to send these people, these experts, judicial experts, out to pasture when they reach 60 years old, to Hamilton, seems absurd, patently absurd. He acknowledges that as part of the process of aging, so also our intellectual as well as our physical skills deteriorate. But in number 79, Hamilton makes the point that most people would agree that as we age, it's usually our physical skills that are compromised before our intellectual skills. In light of the concerns we have in today's world about Alzheimer's, I think some of us might raise questions about Hamilton's assumptions here. But he makes the point, Hamilton makes the point that in the state of New York, for example, the New York Constitution mandates that a member of the court must retire when he reaches 60 years old. Hamilton lists himself as an opponent of that law. He said it's part of the Constitution here and I can't change it, but I don't agree with it. And so his position in Federalist number 79 is to make sure that no such cap or no such limitation applies to members of the federal court under the Constitution. But first, the issue of compensation. And this is a direct quote from the Constitution of the United States, and Hamilton recites this in Federalist number 79. In Article 3 of the Constitution on the judicial branch of government, the document says that the judges of the United States shall at stated times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office, unquote. There's no interpretation here for the Supreme Court. There's nothing here that would cause discord between Justice Scalia and Justice Stevens, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or Justice Sotomayor, or the newest Justice, Irene Kagan. This is straight up stuff. This is one of the quotations, one of the easier Federalist papers, because it's not as abstract, it's not as theoretical, it's not as intellectually challenging. Hamilton says the Constitution makes the point that judges at the federal level will receive pay which cannot be diminished while they are in office. If you want to change the pay of the justices, you must do it after they retire when the new justices come in. But you cannot diminish it. You can only raise it. And in 79, Hamilton makes the distinction between the president's salary, as articulated as explained in the Constitution, and the salary given to members of the court. According to the Constitution of the United States, in Article 2, the president's salary is set by Congress. Theoretically, Congress could lower the salary of the president. They couldn't do it to a sitting president, but once that president left office, they could establish a new pay scale for the incoming president. It could be higher, probably would be higher, but it could also be lower. But when it comes to members of the court, the Constitution forbids the lowering of their salaries while they are in office. This Hamilton defends in 79 as key to the independence of the judiciary. And he makes the point almost at the very beginning of Federalist number 79, and he puts all of this in capitals. A power over a man's subsistence amounts to a power over his will. If you control what a person makes, thereby you control what a person does. Because in controlling his salary, you are effectively controlling his behavior. Consequently, if the justices are going to be as independent and perform the kind of role that Hamilton outlines for them in Federalist number 78, then you must protect their independence by forbidding Congress from reducing their salaries while they are in office. And that's more than half of Federalist number 79. Then he goes into the issue of how do you get rid of the justices. And he talks about the right of impeachment. And he makes the point, I want to be specific here because I don't want to misquote Hamilton. The provision for support of the justices, their salaries, bears every mark of prudence and efficacy, Hamilton says. And it may be safely affirmed that together with the permanent tenure of their offices, it affords a better prospect of their independence. So that's just what I said, that, you know, the combination of a salary that can't be lowered and lifetime appointment guarantees the independence of the judges, and that's what's necessary here. But now the question comes about getting rid of justices. They are liable to be impeached, Hamilton says, for malconduct by the House of Representatives and tried by the Senate. That's the way you can get rid of them, for malfeasance in office. But now comes the more debatable issue, the difficult issue of when a judge becomes infirm, when a judge reaches the point where he's no longer capable of serving. This becomes a difficult animal, Hamilton says. The want of a provision for removing the judges on account of inability has been a subject of complaint, Hamilton says. So consequently, he's got to deal with it. But all considerate men will be sensible that such a provision would either not be practiced upon or would be more liable to abuse than calculated to answer any good purpose. The mensuration of the faculties of the mind has, I believe, no place in the catalog of known arts. In other words, we don't know, we don't understand the process of aging as it affects the mind. We sure as heck can't make a law about it when we really aren't clear on how it works. But all considerate men, Hamilton says, are sensible that such a provision would be more likely to be abused or would not really fulfill the purpose for which, in other words, we'd be venturing into an area that we really don't understand, and all we'd be doing was, if we did it, would be by putting a limit, an age limit, we would be creating something that it could either be abused or just wouldn't work. An attempt to fix the boundary between regions of ability and inability, Hamilton says, would much oftener give scope to personal and party attachments and enmities than advance the interests of justice or the public good. We'd get into more trouble than it would be benefit for us. The result, he says, except in the case of insanity, must for the most part be arbitrary. And then he gets into the issue of age itself, and this is the final paragraph of Federalist number 79. He acknowledges the Constitution of New York, to avoid investigations that must forever be vague and dangerous, has taken a particular age as the criterion of inability. In other words, by passing a law saying you have to retire at 60, the state of New York has basically declared that you become disabled mentally, intellectually, when you reach 60 years old. No man can be a judge beyond 60, Hamilton says. I believe there are few at present who do not disapprove of this provision. There's no station in relation to which it is less proper than to that of a judge. None of us can know what a person's going to be like at 60 years old. But when it comes to a judge, Hamilton says, it's even worse than in other cases. Why? Because of the expertise in the law that a judge possesses. The deliberating and comparing faculties generally preserve their strength much beyond that period in men who survive it. And when, in addition to this circumstance, we consider how few there are who outlive the season of intellectual vigor, and how improbable it is that any considerable portion of the bench, whether more or less numerous, should be in such a situation at the same time, we shall be ready to conclude that limitations of this sort have little to recommend them. In other words, given the fact that we can't be precise, given the fact that we would be terminating the services of highly skilled people, we would be denying ourselves access to their wisdom once they reached a certain age, whether in fact their wisdom was impaired or not. Given these realities, Hamilton says, it would be ridiculous, it would be foolish on our parts to do anything to maximize service on the courts. In a republic, Hamilton says, where fortunes are not affluent and pensions not expedient, the dismission of men from stations in which they have served their country long and usefully, on which they depend for subsistence, and from which it will be too late to resort to any other occupation for a livelihood, ought to have some better apology to humanity than is to be found in the imaginary danger of a superannuated bench. In other words, given people's fear that the members of the court might become too old to serve wisely, all of the suggestions that are possible to address that contingency are worse than the solution. In other words, it's one of those issues Madison talked about where the cure is worse than the disease. Anything we would do would be a negative. The best we can do is assume that all members of the court are not going to arrive at levels of inability at the same time. And so consequently, Federalist number 79 dismisses the idea of age limitations on service of the judges in order to preserve their expertise, and forbids the lowering of their services in order to defend their independence. And those are the two major elements that constitute Federalist number 79. It's the most straightforward, it's the briefest, it's the Federalist paper that seems to me to constitute the least need for interpretation. It's common sense, it's logical, but it's important. And I think Hamilton had to make the point that there were people out there at the time who were trying to find every conceivable excuse in the world they could to attack the Constitution. And so they attacked it on age, they attacked it on the independence of the court. But given the definition of duties that Hamilton addresses in Federalist number 78, it seems absolutely critical to him that you follow up 78 with 79 and saying this is the way we assure the existence of independent judges. And so that's 79. I don't think there's a whole lot of controversy about that particular Federalist paper. Federalist number 80, on the other hand, addresses the particular areas in the Constitution where the federal courts will hold reign. In other words, what areas can the federal courts hear, and in what areas are they forbidden to interfere with the state courts? And I think that's the next issue that we need to deal with, and we'll try to deal with Federalist number 80 tomorrow. In our abbreviated 1-hour program, we will begin 1 hour later tomorrow than we have today. We are currently at 58 minutes after the hour. Our time together is just about up. I want to thank you for being with us. I hope this has been informative. For me personally, it's been very, very helpful because it has forced me to put this stuff into context for my own understanding as well. So I want to thank you for tuning into the Virtual Center today. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. It's cold. Most of the country is in a cold spell for the next few days. So be safe, take care, enjoy, love each other, and try to make plans to come back and join us again here at the Virtual Center. We'll be back again tomorrow. In the meantime, thank you, good evening, and be safe.